In this video, we're going to explain the oscillator section, and we're going to take a look at the different waveforms available and the various different ways they can interact with each other. So oscillators are the building blocks of a sound in the synthesizer. So we have two available right here on the front panel, and these are the master oscillators, and then there's a sub-oscillator, which is the slave of oscillator 1. And what that means is its frequency is tied to the frequency of oscillator 1, but it's always going to be 1 octave or 2 octaves below it. We'll come back to the sub-oscillator in a minute. First thing you want to know about the VCO section, though, is how to actually fade in the waveforms or mix them into the signal. And that's done down here in the mixer section. And the way it works is the middle position is off. When the switch is at the middle, you won't hear anything. And when you turn it to the left, you'll either get a sawtooth, or to the right, you'll get a pulse, depending on what the label says right here. For example, on this mixer, if we take it to the left, we get a sub, which is a sub-oscillator. If we take it to the right, we get noise. So, as you can see right now, we are listening to VCO1 and we're listening to the saw wave. Now, you can't actually mix saw and pulse on the same oscillator in this synth, but you can mix two different oscillators to mix the waveforms. So let's listen to the sawtooth. Let's actually have a look at the sawtooth as well. You can see the shape right here. The difference between this and a standard sawtooth that you might see on a purely digital synth that's not emulating anything is the shape is a little different on this one. A little bit more of a shark fin perhaps than a actual saw. And the curve and the sort of gentle slope is what gives the Oberheim its distinctive brassy sound. Now we'll switch to the pulse wave. Now the pulse wave waveform can be shaped with this control here, the pulse width. While we're in the middle setting, we have a square waveform. Let's just take a look at that. Now, as you can see here, this does not really look much like a square either. It's quite pinched. A square would usually be, the typical way we'd represent a square is like this here. But you can see the reality is on this particular synth, it's not really much of a square waveform like that. This is part of the classic Oberheim sound, but many analog synthesizers do not have an actual square when you look at them in the waveform analyzers. Now, one thing we can do is shape this pulse waveform, so let me just move this to the side here. Move it down to 10%. Now we're shortening the pulse so that it's a very small range of the actual waveform cycle, and that's why it sounds quite thin. If we go back to the square waveform, then start moving up, we get that shorter part in the negative range here. So again, this sounds quite thin as well. Now we can actually modulate this. And that's one of the great things about the pulse width waveform is how it can be modulated to create this sort of animation. But we'll look at modulating the pulse width in one of the later videos. So I'm just going to switch this to mono, and I'm going to take out VCO1 and bring in VCO2. As you'll hear, it's exactly the same. I'm going to bring in the sub. Now this is 1 octave below oscillator 1. So if I move oscillator 1's frequency, the sub-oscillator moves with it. And I can have it go 2 octaves below as well. Now if I bring VCO1 back in, and I can change the waveform from square to sawtooth, or I can have it as a sine wave. Now sine waves are just a pure fundamental waveform, so they produce fantastic basses, but they're also great in the very high range as well, where you can get more bell-like tones. And we'll look into programming some interesting sounds with sine waves later on. So the sub-oscillator is designed mostly to sit underneath oscillator 1, but there are no reasons why you can't change that. For example, I'm going to bring in VCO2, and in this case, VCO2 is going to be lower than the sub-oscillator. So it's handy to remember that although sub-oscillator is always below the frequency of oscillator 1, it doesn't have to be below the frequency of oscillator 2. Okay, now the next thing we can look at is noise. Now, noise will come in incredibly useful later when we look at doing some percussion sounds. It's also useful for, say, pads, special effects, and it's also useful to use it in small amounts to add a little bit of grit. So to show you that, that's no noise at all. That's just a little bit of noise creeping in there. You can see it adds quite a lot of interesting texture to the top end. And that's quite a lot of noise there. So that's how you mix the waveforms. The other great thing you can do with the waveforms is synchronize them. Now, synchronizing waveforms, let me just show you the waveform again on our oscilloscope. So you can see this repetition here. What we're looking at here is the cycles of a waveform. So we have a cycle beginning, say here, comes down to here, and then it drops down here, and then it starts again. We see the same pattern repeating over and over. And this single shape is the actual waveform, and this is a single cycle of this waveform. So what happens with sync mode is VCO2's cycle is always reset in line with VCO1's cycle. The speed of an oscillator cycle is going to depend on the frequency of that oscillator cycle, in other words, the pitch. So if we have a long cycle or a low pitch on oscillator 1 and a higher one on oscillator 2, this is going to cause oscillator 2 to behave very differently from it would if it were free. So once it's hard synced, it no longer follows a natural cyclic pattern. It resets according to the frequency cycle of VCO1. So let me just demonstrate that because it's kind of easier to hear than it is to explain sometimes. So I'm going to take VCO1 out of the equation when it comes to actually hearing it, because we don't need to actually hear VCO1 right now to hear this effect. We're just going to listen to VCO2. Now, this gets more interesting when we start to modulate the frequency, and you'll notice here we've got this modulation control. If I pull this to the left, we're actually starting to modulate this now by LFO1. So it sounds a little bit odd right now, but we're actually going to program that in a little more detail when we come to the envelope mode, give a bit more definition to that sync sound. Now, if we flip this the other way around, we can actually modulate the pulse width. So if we go back to pulse, now if I take the sync off, you can hear that we're just modulating the pulse width like we were manually earlier. But if I turn synchronization on, and then I start to move the pitch up here, and it gets especially interesting when we use some detuning. Finally, I just want to note that there's also a pulse width control for the square wave on the sub-oscillator, which you can move around to get a pulse waveform. Now, you can't actually use this for modulation like you can over here from the front panel, but there are some other controls that we're going to look at later on when we go to open up the back panel. So that's it for this video on the oscillator section. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next one.